The year was 1865, and the wind howled through the cracked bones of the prairie like it was morning, too. Ash-gray clouds drifted over the high plains, and the funeral was already half forgotten by the men leaning on wagons at the edge of the cemetery plot. They muttered about weather and cattle prices. No one mentioned Thomas Carter. Not directly, just as well. He was buried beneath 6 feet of hard earth and suspicion, and this town didn't much care to exhume either. Mary Ann Carter stood by the wooden cross, her black dress too thin for the cold bite of late autumn. One gloved hand held her boy, little Eli, tucked tight against her hip. The other hung useless at her side. Her face was dry. She'd cried herself empty on the night they brought Thomas home in the back of a buckboard wagon. His blood dried into the wood slats. Now, the priest was mumbling words even he didn't believe, and Ezekiel Carter, Thomas's father, stood beside her like a monument chiseled from old granite. His hat cast a long shadow across her boots. He was a good son, Ezekiel muttered after the last shovel of dirt hit the grave. His voice was flat as prairie dust. Marion glanced at him. He was a better man. Ezekiel didn't respond. He gave a single nod, tipped his hat to the ground like it owed him respect, and turned back toward the wagon. Marion stayed, long after the others left, after the whispers faded and the wind settled. Only when the first drop of rain tapped against her bonnet did she move, stepping away from the fresh mound with her child tight in her arms. The Carter Ranch sat 10 miles east of town, straddling land too dry for crops and too stubborn for easy cattle. Ezekiel's house rose on a ridge like a scar on the land, wide, weathered, and proud. Inside, it smelled of pine wood and tobacco. The hearth glowed with a thin fire. "Got a room ready for you," Ezekiel said as he stomped mud off his boots. "You'll stay until you get your feet." Marion didn't argue. Not then. Not with nowhere else to go. She sat Eli on the floor and peeled off her gloves with stiff fingers. The boy waddled toward the fire, dragging a small wooden horse that Thomas had carved for him. "Much obliged," she said quietly. Ezekiel grunted. "Your family." He walked off down the hall, boots thudding against the floorboards like slow drumbeats. Mary Ann stood there a long while, hands still gripping the back of a chair, heart thudding like it knew something she didn't. That night, after putting Eli to bed, she wandered the old halls of the house like a ghost. There were no photographs on the walls, just framed land deeds and newspaper clippings about cattle drives, market wins, and one yellowed headline, "Carter Ranch Survives Drought of '59. She stopped at Thomas's old room. It smelled faintly of cedar and gun oil. She crossed the threshold like it might burn her. The bed was neatly made, the trunk at the foot untouched. When she opened it, the hinges creaked like they hadn't moved in months. Inside, folded shirts, a spare rifle holster, a flask, and his journal. She hesitated, then picked it up. The first few pages were about cattle weights, fencing schedules, and market trips. But near the back, Thomas's handwriting grew tighter, angrier. "Pa's been acting strange. Talking with that surveyor too often. Won't tell me why he wants to shift the southern fence line." Another entry. "Found him talking with Sheriff Lyle behind the post office. Lyle saw me and stopped talking. Pa said it's not my concern. But I saw the map. He's selling land. Land that ain't his yet." The last entry made her breath hitch. "If anything happens to me, Marion should know Pa's hiding something. If he thinks I'll let him cut me out." It ended there. She closed the book and sat on the bed in silence, her hands trembling in her lap. Outside, coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the hills. Inside, the house settled with slow creaks like it, too, had secrets it didn't want to share. At breakfast the next morning, Ezekiel poured coffee into tin cups and slid one across the table. "Got work to do. You'll help with the books, if you're able." Thomas never did learn the numbers. Marion took the cup, but didn't drink. "You were planning on selling part of the land, weren't you?" He didn't blink. "Thomas told you that?" She met his eyes. He wrote it down. Ezekiel sipped his coffee. He didn't understand how things work. "That south section's not worth the fence we built around it. Dry and empty. I've got debts. Thomas wanted to play rancher, but ranchin' ain't for dreamers. It's for men who make hard choices. He thought you were cutting him out." Ezekiel's voice turned cold. "Thomas was my son. I gave him everything. And now he's gone. I'd ask you not to speak ill of the dead. I wasn't. Silence stretched between them like a drawn rope. Later, Marianne walked the fence line with Eli strapped to her back, wrapped in wool. The wind cut through her coat, but she welcomed the cold. It kept her sharp. The south land wasn't dry. It had a trickle of water running through it. Trees. Game tracks. She crouched near the creek bed and saw fresh boot prints, too large for Thomas's. Someone had been here recently. Someone besides Ezekiel. The next evening, she visited the sheriff. Sheriff Lyle sat behind his desk with a toothpick between his teeth and a shotgun within reach. Marianne, sorry for your loss. You knew Thomas suspected something. He wrote about you meeting with Ezekiel behind the post office. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. A lot of men talk behind buildings. Doesn't mean they're plotting murder. I didn't say murder. You didn't have to. He stood slowly, brushing dust off his vest. Thomas was a good boy, but he didn't understand the pressure that comes with keeping this town alive. We make sacrifices, all of us. That's the cost of survival out here. Is that what he was? A sacrifice? Lyle's jaw tightened. You got a child to think about. Don't go digging in places that'll leave you buried next to your husband. She left without another word. That night, thunder rolled over the hills. Marian bolted upright in bed at a creak outside her door. Footsteps. She reached for the lamp, but froze when she saw the shadow beneath the crack of her door. A pause, then retreating steps. In the morning, nothing was said. Ezekiel sipped his coffee as usual, but he watched her closer now, measured, like a man waiting for a horse to buck. Eli played quietly in the parlor. Marianne sat nearby, hands in her lap. Her fingers found the spine of Thomas's journal, hidden beneath her skirt. Her mind burned with 100 questions, but she kept her voice soft when she asked, "Did Thomas die alone?" Ezekiel didn't look up from his paper. "He died on the range. That's how men go out here. You weren't with him?" He folded the paper slowly. "Already told the sheriff. Horse spooked. Broke his neck. I buried him myself." She nodded slowly, the lies sitting heavy in the air like fog. 2 days later, she searched the house again. A creaking floorboard in Thomas's room caught her ear. Beneath it, a folded map, a deed, and an unsigned contract. A sale of land, backdated, not legal. The buyer? A mining company from Denver. Thomas's name wasn't on it. Her heart pounded as she stared at the crooked signature, Ezekiel Carter. Later that evening, she found herself by the fire, journal open in her lap, pages fluttering from the wind leaking through the chimney. Ezekiel stood in the doorway. His voice was low. "That book's poison, Marianne. It'll make you see ghosts that ain't there." "I don't believe in ghosts," she said. "Only men who think they can bury the truth with a shovel." Ezekiel's lips curled just slightly. "This house, this land, it's all you've got now. Don't squander it chasing things you'll wish you hadn't found." He turned and walked away, leaving only the pop and hiss of the fire behind him. Marianne stared into the flames. She saw Thomas there, not his face, but the feeling of him, his laugh, his dreams, the way he'd hold her hand in silence on cold nights like this. She looked down at Eli asleep beside her, his small chest rising and falling, innocent and unaware. She wasn't just a widow. She was a mother, a protector, a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. When she closed the journal, her hands no longer shook. In the days that followed, she smiled when Ezekiel entered the room, cooked breakfast, played the part. But every night, she mapped the terrain. Every whisper she heard, she remembered. She watched who came and went from the ranch. And she waited for the moment he'd slip. For now, she was the quiet wind across the prairie. But when the storm came, it would have her name in its mouth. The morning came heavy with frost, the kind that painted the windows with delicate webs and turned the porch steps slick beneath worn boots. Marianne stood at the edge of the Carter Ranch house, her shawl tight around her shoulders, watching a hawk circle high above the hills. Her breath fogged in the chill air, but her heart burned like a branding iron. She'd spent the last 2 nights rereading Thomas's journal, tracing each word like it was his voice whispering from beyond. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and it was uglier than she feared. The sale contract, the lies, The watchful silence of Ezekiel. Her husband hadn't died from a fall. He'd been silenced, and now she would not be. Inside, Ezekiel leaned over the ledger book at the dining table. His fingers tapped against the wood in that slow, arrhythmic pattern he had when calculating expenses, or, more likely, deciding who he could afford to lose. "You're up early," he muttered without looking. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded once. "Dreams get darker in the cold months." She sat across from him. "You ever have dreams, Ezekiel? Ones you can't shake?" He glanced up, eyes narrowing. "I learned not to dream. Waste of time." Mary Ann reached into her apron and placed the journal on the table between them. His eyes flicked to it. A pause like the air had thinned. "You ever read it?" she asked softly. "No need," he said, pushing it aside. "Thomas was good with cattle, not with people." "I read it," she said, her voice calm. "All of it." He stared at her, and for the first time, there was something behind his eyes that looked a lot like fear, buried beneath layers of pride and callous indifference. It vanished just as quickly. "Books don't always tell the truth," he said. "People write what they need to believe." "And you? What do you believe, Ezekiel?" He stood slowly, the legs of his chair groaning across the floor. "I believe you're in over your head. This land is hard. The people, harder. Men like Thomas," he paused. "They don't last long. Not unless they learn the rules." She looked up at him. "And if the rules are wrong?" His lips curled. "Then you either play the game or get buried under it." He left her there, the ledger book open, the fire crackling low. That afternoon, Mary Ann rode into town with Eli bundled in front of her, the wind snapping at her bonnet. The town looked the same as always, stoic, weathered, hunched against the wind, but the people looked different now. Or maybe she was seeing clearer. At the general store, old Mrs. Harper stiffened when Mary Ann entered. The blacksmith's wife, who once cooed at Eli in his cradle, now avoided her eyes. Something unspoken rippled through the townsfolk. She was no longer just a widow. She was a question. She made her way to the small, clapboard church where Reverend Chase kept quiet records and quieter opinions. He greeted her at the door with a tight smile. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "what can I do for you? I need to know if Thomas ever brought you anything. Confessed anything." The Reverend hesitated. Thomas, he was troubled near the end. Spoke of his father often. Accused him of things he couldn't prove. "But he tried to," she said. "He did." The Reverend shifted. "But he also asked me to keep things private. I honored that while he was alive. And now—" The Reverend studied her. "Now I suppose keeping secrets serves no one." He led her to the back office and retrieved a folded letter from the bottom drawer of his desk. "He gave me this 2 weeks before his death. Told me to give it to you only if you asked." Her hands shook as she unfolded the parchment. "Mary Ann, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I hope it was an accident. But if it wasn't, I need you to fight. Not for revenge, but for what's right. Eli deserves better than this cursed land. Don't trust Pa, don't trust Sheriff Lyle. And if you must run, go to James Talltree. He's the only one I ever trusted with my life." Her breath caught. She knew that name. A Cheyenne scout once hired by the town during a drought season. He helped them find water, warned of raids. Then vanished after a dispute with Ezekiel. Some claimed he stole horses. Others said he simply saw too much. She left the church with the letter pressed to her chest. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, bitter flakes that melted against her cheeks. By evening, she'd packed what little she could carry. One satchel, one child, one revolver. Ezekiel didn't see her leave. She saddled the horse quietly, whispering comfort into its ear, wrapping Eli tight to her back. Then she rode south, toward the lands beyond the Carter claim, toward old territory the townsfolk whispered about but never visited. She didn't get far. Just past the tree line, something cracked loud as a gunshot. The horse reared, screamed. Mary Ann was thrown. The world tilted. Snow in her mouth, blood at her brow. Eli cried behind her, his voice thin and terrified. She crawled toward him, cradling him to her chest, shielding him from the wind. Then silence, but not for long. Footsteps, crunching snow. She gripped the revolver with shaking fingers, raising it with all the strength she had left. A man stepped into the clearing, tall, wrapped in a blanket coat, rifle across his back. His face was shadowed beneath a fur-lined hood. "Easy," he said. "You look like you've seen the devil." "Maybe I have," she whispered. "Name's James." She stared. "James Talltree." He crouched slowly. "That'd be me." She didn't lower the gun. "You knew Thomas." He nodded. "He was the only Carter who treated me like a man." "You were in his letter." James studied her. "Then I reckon you're in more danger than you know." He helped her sit up, then lifted Eli gently into his arms. The boy clung to him without protest. "About a place," James said. "You can rest. Then we figure out what comes next." She followed him through the snow, barely able to walk. Her side burned where she'd hit the ground. Blood soaked her skirts, but she walked anyway. They arrived at a small cabin nestled between stone cliffs and a frozen creek. It was nothing more than 4 walls and a stove, but it was warm, and for the first time in days, Marianne didn't feel eyes on her back. James boiled water for tea, sat across from her, elbows on knees. "So," he said, "what did Ezekiel do?" She told him everything. By the end, his jaw was tight. His eyes burned like coals. "I left the ranch after I saw what he did," James said. "He and Lyle killed a surveyor. Man had papers. Claimed part of the land was government protected. They buried him out past the ridge. Said he was a raider. I knew better. Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Tried." Sheriff made sure no one listened. "I had 2 choices. Run or end up like that surveyor." Marianne stared into the flames. "Then we both ran." "No," James said. "We both survived, but running won't end this." She looked up. "What will?" James stood and pulled an oilskin map from a drawer. Spread on the table. "These are old mining routes. Ezekiel's selling the Southland because there's silver under it. That's what this all been about." She leaned in, reading the markings. "Then he's still hiding the contract. Still moving money." "Exactly. But how do we stop him?" James pointed to a mark on the ridge. "You don't." "I do. You ride for the fort. Show them the journal. The letter. Get help. Marshall's office might still care." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving Eli." "Then take him. I'll make noise here. Give you time." Marian hesitated. Every inch of her body wanted to run, but every beat of her heart wanted to fight. "I'll go," she said. "But when I come back, I want him to see me. I want him to know it was me who brought him down." James nodded once. "That," he said, "I can't promise." Outside, the wind howled again, but this time it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like a warning. The wind off the ridge carried the dry scent of mesquite and smoke, and Marianne Carter leaned low over the saddle, eyes narrowed against the dust. Eli was slung across her back, asleep and bundled tight, his breath warm on her neck. The ride from the fort had been hard, but her mind burned hotter than the sun overhead. In her satchel were the copies, Thomas's journal, his last letter, the fraudulent land deed, and an affidavit from a federal marshal who'd promised to follow once his detachment arrived. But she wouldn't wait for them. This had to end with her. The Carter Ranch sprawled across the horizon, silhouetted against the sinking sun like a fortress of bone. From the hills above, she could see riders near the corral, loading cattle into wagons. Ezekiel's last move before the sale. She counted 5 men. No sign of James. No sign of the boy's father. Only the man who'd stolen everything. She dismounted, unslung the carbine from the saddle holster, and knelt by a stone outcrop. Below, the house's windows glinted in the dying light. She pulled Eli gently from her back, kissed his brow, and whispered, "Stay down. Stay still." She tucked him beneath the overhang, wrapping his blanket around him. His eyes blinked open, but he didn't cry. Marianne rose and began the descent. James Talltree struck first. A shot cracked from the tree line to the east, and one of Ezekiel's men dropped like a sack of corn. Confusion followed. The other hand scattered, cursing, ducking behind wagons and troughs. She moved like she had on the range in better days, quiet, sharp, precise. She reached the barn and slipped inside. The horses whinnied nervously. Another shot echoed through the hills. Then another. She slid behind the stall doors and peeked through the slats. A rider galloped past, shouting, "We're under fire." Then came the bark of Ezekiel's voice from a porch. "Hold your ground, damn it. It's just one man. Find him." He didn't know she was here. She crept through the back, out past the tack room, and made her way along the edge of the house. James had drawn their attention, just like he promised. She had maybe 5 minutes before they regrouped. The front door was unlocked. She slipped in. The inside was darker than she remembered. Thicker. The old wood seemed to absorb sound like a secret. She crept down the hall, every creak like thunder in her ears. Eli's room was empty. Her breath hitched. Her hand went to her sidearm. She turned the corner toward Thomas's old room and froze. Ezekiel stood there, rifle cradled casually in his arms, like he'd been waiting. "Took you long enough," he said. She raised the pistol, hand steady. "Where's Eli?" "In good hands." He nodded to the parlor. "I knew you'd come back. Should have guessed you wouldn't be able to leave things well enough alone." She didn't lower the weapon. "He was your son, and a fool. Soft-hearted and righteous. You think it's what built this ranch? What kept the wolves at bay?" He took a step forward. "No, it was blood and fire and hard choices. Things Thomas didn't have the stomach for." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "You killed him. I let the land take him. That's different." She fired. The bullet tore across his shoulder, spinning him back. The rifle clattered to the floor. He roared in pain, but didn't fall. Instead, he charged. She barely had time to dodge as his fist slammed into the wall behind her. The pistol flew from her grasp, skittering across the floor. She scrambled after it, but he caught her by the arm and threw her into the sideboard. Wood splintered. Pain bloomed along her ribs. "You think you can destroy what I built?" he snarled, blood seeping through his shirt. "You're a girl in mourning, not a warrior." She kicked him hard in the knee. He stumbled. She crawled toward the gun, fingers outstretched. He grabbed her ankle. "Eli doesn't need your lies," he growled. "He needs a legacy. My legacy." Marion twisted, kicked again, then grabbed a broken chair leg and drove it into his wounded shoulder. He screamed. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the pistol, and turned just as he lunged again. One shot. Center mass. He fell against the wall, slid down, and gasped like a fish on dry land. Blood spread across the floor. Marion stood over him, breathing hard, pistol still raised. "You didn't build a legacy," she said. "You built a graveyard." Outside, the gunfire had stopped. The door creaked open behind her, and James stepped in, rifle still in hand. He looked at Ezekiel, then at her. "You all right?" She nodded. "Where's Eli?" James smiled faintly. "Right where you left him. Smart boy. Didn't make a sound." She holstered the pistol and knelt beside Ezekiel. He was still alive, barely. "You lost," she said. His eyes were dull now, but his voice still carried venom. "They'll never follow you. A woman with dirt on her hands. You'll be nothing out here." "Then I'll be nothing," she whispered. "But I'll be free." Outside, riders approached. Not Carter men. Uniformed. The marshal's posse. Marianne stood as the door swung wide, and the lead marshal stepped in, hand on his badge. "Which one's Ezekiel Carter?" he asked. She pointed. "The one who tried to sell stolen land and bury anyone who got in his way." The marshal looked down at the dying man, then nodded to his men. "Get the doc. Then get the papers." Ezekiel coughed weakly. "That land was mine." "No," the marshal said flatly. "It was never yours. Not legally." James walked to Marianne's side, resting a hand on her shoulder. The rest passed in a blur. Ezekiel was loaded into a wagon. His men, those who hadn't run off, surrendered or were taken. The Carter brand would no longer carry weight the way it had. Later, as the stars lit up the night sky, Marianne sat on the porch, Eli asleep in her lap. James stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "Reckon they'll be talking about this for years," he said. "I don't care if they talk," she said. "I care that they remember." He nodded. "What do you do now?" She looked out over the land. The same hills Thomas had dreamed of fencing, the stream he once said would carry their future. "I'll rebuild it. Not for profit. Not for pride. For Eli." James smiled. "Could use a good foreman." She looked up at him, then smiled back. "You offering?" "Maybe. Depends if there's coffee in the mornings." She laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. "There's always coffee." The prairie wind whispered across the fields. From the porch, the Carter ranch looked different. Not smaller, just no longer owned by fear. Marianne Carter had walked through fire, betrayal, and blood, and come out with more than vengeance. She'd come out with purpose, and in the land of dust and death, that was more than most ever found.